Inside the gilded dining room of Tavola d'Oro, one of Greenwich's most exclusive Italian restaurants, Caroline Ashford set down her menu and turned to the waiter with a smile that carried no warmth at all. She had just ordered in flawless Italian, every syllable precise, every word chosen to impress. Then she looked him up and down and said, "Don't worry, I wouldn't expect someone who carries plates for a living to understand real Italian." Beside her, Vivian Blake covered her mouth and laughed, her eyes scanning the waiter like he was part of the furniture. But the waiter didn't flinch. He set his pen down, straightened his back, looked Caroline directly in the eyes, and answered in Italian, so perfect, so effortlessly Florentine, that the words seemed to hang in the chandelier light. Caroline's smile vanished. Vivian's hand dropped, and from a few tables behind them, guests who had heard every word began to smile quiet, knowing smiles aimed squarely at the two women. For the first time in her life, Caroline Ashford was the one being looked down upon. 3 hours earlier, Nathan Cross stood outside a daycare center in downtown Greenwich, waiting for the door to open. He was 34 years old, tall, lean, with calloused hands and a wedding ring he hadn't taken off in 3 years. When the door swung open, a 6-year-old girl with brown curls and her mother's wide eyes came running toward him. Sophie Cross threw herself into his arms, and he caught her the way he always did, one arm under her, the other steadying her backpack. She smelled like finger paint and apple juice, and she was already talking before he set her down. "Daddy, what's étoile?" she asked, holding up a small notebook with a worn leather cover. The pages were filled with handwriting that wasn't hers, words in French, each one accompanied by a tiny drawing. A house. A cat. A moon. Star. Nathan said. Sophie flipped the page and pointed. Mommy drew a star next to it. "See?" He looked at the small, 5-pointed star his wife had sketched in blue ink, and something tightened behind his ribs. He kissed Sophie's forehead. "I see it." He walked her 3 blocks to the apartment building where Mrs. Kowalski lived, a retired schoolteacher of 67 who watched Sophie every evening for free because, as she put it, "That child is the best company I've had since my husband passed." Sophie handed Nathan the notebook as they walked, and he slipped it into her backpack with the care of someone handling a document that could not be replaced. At the door, Mrs. Kowalski was already waiting with a plate of sugar cookies and a crossword puzzle folded on the kitchen table. Nathan thanked her, knelt down, hugged Sophie one more time, and headed to work. Tavola d'Oro occupied the ground floor of a limestone building on Greenwich Avenue. White tablecloths, amber lighting, wine bottles displayed like museum pieces behind glass. Nathan entered through the service door, changed into his uniform black vest, pink dress shirt, black bow tie, and clocked in. He had been working here for 2 years. In that time, he had become the best waiter on staff. He remembered regulars' names, pronounced every Italian dish without hesitation, never complained about difficult guests, and always volunteered for the evening shift so he could spend his days with Sophie. Marco Bellini, the floor manager, was a 45-year-old Italian-American who ran the dining room like a theater director. He liked Nathan. More than liked him, he respected him, though he couldn't quite explain why. There was something about Nathan that didn't fit the uniform. The way he carried himself, the way he spoke to guests as though he were welcoming them into his own home, the quiet precision of his manners. Marco didn't know Nathan's past. He only knew that Nathan was unusually polished for a waiter, that he never once asked for a day shift, and that sometimes, when the restaurant played Italian opera softly in the background, Nathan would mouth the words without realizing it. At 7:45, the front door opened, and 2 women walked in as though the restaurant had been waiting for them. Caroline Ashford wore an emerald green dress that caught the light with every step. Her brown hair was swept up, her earrings were small diamonds, and her posture suggested she had never in her life entered a room without expecting it to notice. Beside her, Vivian Blake, blonde, red dress, heels that clicked against the marble floor, laughed at something Caroline said in French. The hostess led them to table 12, the window-side booth reserved for the restaurant's most valued guests. Caroline ordered a bottle of Barolo before she even sat down, addressing the hostess in Italian. Vivienne grinned. "You always make them nervous," she said. "That's the point," Caroline replied. This was their game, a ritual they had performed at dozens of restaurants, hotels, and wine bars across 3 continents. Caroline Ashford, CEO of Ashford Global Imports, a company that supplied high-end European wines and gourmet foods to restaurants across the eastern seaboard, used foreign languages the way other women use designer handbags. Not to communicate, but to separate. To remind everyone within earshot that she belonged to a world they could not enter. And Vivienne, her oldest friend, heir to a family trust fund she had never had to earn, was always there to watch and applaud. Nathan was assigned to table 12. He approached with his order pad and a polite smile. "Good evening. Welcome to Tavola d'Oro." Caroline looked at him. She took in the vest, the calloused hands, the old wedding band on his left ring finger. She noticed the way he stood, not stiff, not servile, but straight in a way that suggested the posture came from somewhere other than restaurant training, and she decided, as she always did with service staff, to test him. She opened the menu and began ordering entirely in Italian, rapid, complex, deliberately ornate, using culinary terminology that most native speakers wouldn't bother with in casual conversation. Vivienne covered her mouth and watched Nathan's face, waiting for the confusion, the stammer, the awkward request to repeat. Then Caroline delivered the line she had been building toward all along. She set down the menu, tilted her chin upward, and said, "Don't worry, I wouldn't expect someone who carries plates for a living to understand real Italian." Vivienne laughed behind her hand, her eyes sweeping over Nathan like he was something decorative and ultimately forgettable. A few guests at nearby tables heard it too. An older couple glanced over, frowning. A man in a gray suit paused mid-sip. The air around table 12 shifted, the way it does when someone says something cruel enough that even strangers feel it in their chests. Nathan did not blush. He did not drop his gaze. He did not clench his jaw or shuffle his feet. He simply set his pen down on the order pad, looked Caroline directly in the eyes, and responded in Italian, not the hurried, textbook Italian of a language student, but the smooth, unhurried Florentine dialect of someone who had lived inside the language, who had dreamed in it and argued in it, and once used it to prevent a diplomatic incident at the American embassy in Rome. "The branzino isn't fresh tonight," he said in Italian. "I'd recommend the veal saltimbocca, it's what the chef made for his own family today, and the Barolo you chose pairs better with the ossobuco, not the fish. But of course, you already knew that." The last line. But of course, you already knew that was polite on the surface but razor-sharp beneath. It implied, with surgical precision, that if Caroline truly knew Italian cuisine as well as she pretended, she wouldn't have paired the wine the way she did. Silence. Caroline's smile disappeared. Not slowly, not gracefully, it simply stopped existing, like a candle blown out in a single breath. Vivienne's hand dropped from her mouth. Her eyes darted to Caroline, then to Nathan, then back again, searching for a cue that didn't come. And from a few tables behind them, guests who had heard the entire exchange began to smile, quiet, amused smiles directed squarely at the 2 women. An older gentleman raised his water glass an inch, as if toasting the waiter. His wife pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. Caroline felt the weight of those gazes settle on her shoulders. Her face flushed. Vivienne stared at the tablecloth, suddenly unsure whether laughing was still an option. Nathan gave a small nod. "I'll give you a moment to decide." Then he turned and walked away back straight, steps even, as though the entire incident had been nothing more than a question about the daily special. He moved to another table, greeted the guests with the same calm courtesy, took their order with the same steady hand. That composure bothered Caroline more than anything, because it meant he didn't consider her special, not in any direction. She was not a villain to him. She was not a challenge. She was simply a guest who had been wrong about the wine pairing. Vivienne leaned across the table and whispered, Did he just correct your Italian? In front of everyone? Caroline didn't answer. She stared at the menu, but the words blurred behind something she refused to call tears. For the first time in her life, someone she had classified as beneath her had not only understood her language but surpassed her in it, and had done so without anger, without sarcasm, without even raising his voice. She felt something entirely unfamiliar. The humiliation of being outmatched in public while having no grounds for complaint, because the man had simply been right. At the end of the meal, Caroline left a tip 3 times the usual amount. Vivienne asked why. Good service, Caroline said flatly, but when she walked to her car, she glanced back through the restaurant's window. Nathan was clearing table 12, folding the tablecloth with the same quiet precision he brought to everything. She got in, closed the door, and sat there for a long moment before starting the engine. At 11 o'clock that night, Nathan changed out of his uniform in the back room, traded the vest for an old canvas jacket, and stepped into the cold November air. Marco caught him at the service door and pressed a takeout container into his hands. For your little one, Marco said. Nathan thanked him and started walking. He didn't own a car. The walk home took 20 minutes, through the quiet streets of a town where most people drove vehicles that cost more than his annual salary. His apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building with no elevator. Mrs. Kowalski was reading in the living room when he came in. She waved, whispered that Sophie had been an angel, and let herself out. Sophie was asleep on the couch, one arm draped over the side, the other clutching her French notebook. Nathan lifted her gently, carried her to the bedroom, and tucked the blanket around her shoulders. He sat on the edge of the bed and watched her breathe. On the wall behind him, a framed commendation from the United States Department of State hung face down. He had turned it around the day he accepted the waiter position, because looking at it made him feel like he was visiting a grave. On the shelf across the room, a small wedding photo showed a woman with brown hair and a wide, easy smile, the kind of smile that made strangers want to tell her things. Claire Cross. She had been dead for 3 years, taken by a cancer that had moved so fast the doctors spoke in weeks instead of months. Nathan still cleaned his wedding ring every night before bed, sliding it off, wiping it with the corner of his shirt, holding it up to the light for a moment, and putting it back on. It was the last ritual of his day, and it was the closest thing he had to a prayer. He opened his laptop. An email from the hospital billing department sat at the top of his inbox. Outstanding balance, $47,000. What remained of the treatment that had taken everything Claire had and everything she didn't, the experimental drugs insurance wouldn't cover, the second opinion from a specialist in Boston, the ambulance ride on the last night when Hope had already left the room, but Nathan hadn't been able to stop fighting. Nathan did the math he did every month. Waiter salary plus tips equaled rent, Sophie's daycare, and $400 a month toward the medical debt. Nothing left over. Not for a car, not for new shoes, not for the violin lessons Sophie had mentioned once and never brought up again because she had already learned, at 6 years old, not to ask for things that made her father go quiet. He closed the laptop, looked at his sleeping daughter, and whispered, "We're okay, Claire. We're okay." At the same hour, 4 miles away, Caroline Ashford stood alone in the kitchen of her penthouse. The apartment was enormous, 3,000 square feet of Italian marble, designer furniture, and silence so deep she could hear the wall clock ticking from 2 rooms away. Vivienne had gone home. The evening's humiliation still clung to Caroline like perfume she couldn't wash off. She poured a glass of Brunello and didn't drink it. She opened her phone and searched Tavola d'Oro staff. Nothing came up about Nathan. No LinkedIn profile, no social media, no press mention. That only made it worse. A waiter who spoke Florentine Italian, wore a worn wedding band, had rough hands but the conversational cadence of someone educated far beyond the service industry. Who was he? She called Maggie Byrne, the woman who had been the Ashford family's housekeeper for 23 years. Maggie was 58, sharp-tongued, warm-hearted, and the only person on earth Caroline trusted without calculation. "How was dinner?" Maggie asked. A waiter corrected my Italian. In front of the whole restaurant, Maggie laughed softly on the other end. "And you're still thinking about it at midnight." "That's new." Caroline said nothing because Maggie was right, and they both knew it. The following Saturday, Nathan had no evening shift. He took Sophie to a park near the center of Greenwich, a small green square with old oak trees and iron benches where he spent most of his free mornings. Sophie brought her notebook, sat on a bench, and began sounding out words in French, tracing her mother's handwriting with her finger as though the letters themselves contained some warmth. Nathan walked to a nearby coffee cart to buy 2 hot chocolates, one for himself, one for Sophie, who would let it cool until it was barely warm and then drink the whole thing in one long sip. Caroline Ashford ran every morning. It was the one thing she did entirely alone, no makeup, no jewelry, no designer clothes. Just a gray t-shirt, running shoes, and earbuds playing piano concertos she would never admit to anyone she loved. She had been running for 40 minutes when she stopped near a water fountain at the edge of the park and saw a small girl sitting alone on a bench, whispering in French. Curiosity, or something she wasn't ready to name, pulled her closer. Sophie looked up. Her face broke into a grin so immediate and unguarded that Caroline felt something shift in her chest. "Bonjour, madame," Sophie said, the French syllables cheerful and imprecise. Caroline found herself sitting down on the bench the first time she had sat on a public park bench since she was a child in Geneva. Sophie held up the notebook without hesitation, the way children share things before the world teaches them not to. "Want to see? My mom wrote these before she went to heaven. She wanted me to talk like a French princess." Caroline took the notebook. Her hands trembled slightly. She turned the pages slowly, reading each word in Claire Cross's handwriting. Maison, chat, lune, fleur, each one accompanied by a small drawing. Not the precise strokes of a language teacher, but the tender, uneven lines of a mother who had known she was running out of time and wanted to leave behind something her daughter could hold. "What's your favorite word?" Caroline asked. Sophie turned to a page near the middle and pointed. Mommy drew a little sun next to it. Caroline swallowed hard. She had learned French at 4 years old. Her father had hired private tutors who reported her progress weekly. He had corrected her pronunciation at dinner parties, in front of business associates, in front of household staff, not to teach, but to sharpen. Every mistake was a failure. Every hesitation was proof she wasn't trying hard enough. No one had ever drawn a sun next to a word for her. No one had made language feel like a gift instead of a test. Nathan returned with 2 cups and saw Caroline sitting with his daughter. He recognized her instantly, the woman from table 12, now in a gray t-shirt with her hair down, looking nothing like the person who had tried to humiliate him. The moment hung between them awkward, exposed, stripped of the roles they had played in the restaurant. Sophie broke the silence. "Daddy?" "This lady speaks French, too." Nathan looked at Caroline, then at the notebook in her hands. Caroline returned it carefully. "The way you handle something irreplaceable. Your daughter has a beautiful accent," she said quietly. "She gets it from her mother," Nathan said. His voice was steady, but the sentence carried the full weight of a woman who would never hear her daughter speak French, would never know that Sophie practiced every morning, would never see the sun drawn next to Lumiere. Caroline stood and turned to leave. She made it a few steps before stopping. She looked back at Sophie. "Keep practicing, okay? Your mother would be proud." Then she walked away quickly, pulling out her earbuds without putting them back in. When she was far enough that no one could see, her hands clenched at her sides and her eyes burned with something she hadn't felt since she was a child. That evening, she called Maggie. For the first time in her adult life, she cried while talking about someone other than herself. She was 6, Maggie, reading her dead mother's handwriting in a park, and she smiled like it was the most normal thing in the world. Maggie was quiet for a moment. Then she said gently, "A week later, Caroline returned to Tavola d'Oro for a business lunch with a wine distributor from Napa. Nathan served their table. When it came time to order, Caroline spoke in English plain, direct, without performance. No Italian, no French, no test. Nathan noticed the shift. He gave a small nod, wrote down her order, and moved on. Neither of them acknowledged what had changed, but both understood it was deliberate. 2 days after that, Vivian invited Caroline to lunch at the same restaurant. They sat at table 12 again. Nathan was their waiter again. Vivian, unchanged and cheerfully unaware, slipped into French the moment she saw him approach. She glanced at Nathan and murmured to Caroline in French, assuming he only spoke Italian. "He's handsome for a waiter. Too bad he probably can't afford dinner at his own restaurant." She laughed at her own joke, a light, careless sound. Caroline did not laugh. She watched Nathan, who had clearly understood every word but showed nothing on his face. He had heard worse, in more languages, from people with more power. He simply wrote down their drink order and walked away with the same quiet dignity he brought to every table, every shift, every small indignity the job required him to absorb. And for the first time, Caroline saw Vivian with absolute clarity, the same smile she herself had worn, the same patronizing tone, the same casual cruelty dressed up as wit. She wasn't looking at her best friend. She was looking at a mirror of who she had been 2 weeks earlier, and the reflection made her stomach turn. "What's wrong with you lately?" Vivian asked, studying her across the table. "You've been weird ever since that Italian waiter thing." "Nothing. I'm just tired." After Vivian left, Caroline remained. She waited until Nathan came to clear the dishes, then spoke quietly. Nathan stacked the plates without looking up. "You don't need to apologize for someone else. I'm also apologizing for myself. For that first night," Nathan paused. He set the plates down and looked at her, not the way a waiter looks at a guest, but the way one person measures another when deciding whether they mean what they say. "Apology accepted," he said. "A while ago, actually." A silence settled between them, comfortable in a way neither expected. Then Nathan said, his voice slightly softer than before, "She calls you the lady in the park. She wants to show you more words from her notebook." Caroline didn't respond immediately. She picked up her phone, opened the Notes app, and typed 2 words, "Sophie, Lumiere," as if she were afraid of forgetting, even though she knew she never would. On a Thursday evening 3 weeks after their first encounter, Caroline walked into Tavola d'Oro alone. No Vivienne, no business associate, no purpose she could articulate to anyone, including herself. She sat at table 12, ordered a glass of Chianti, and waited. Nathan brought the wine, noticed she was alone, and poured without comment. The restaurant emptied slowly as the hours passed. Tables were cleared, candles were snuffed. The kitchen noise faded into the occasional clatter of dishes being washed. Caroline remained. When only a handful of guests were left and the dining room had grown quiet, she caught Nathan's eye as he passed. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "With your Italian, your French, why are you here? You could work anywhere." Nathan glanced around the nearly empty room. Then he did something a waiter was never supposed to do. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "My wife got sick 3 years ago," he said. "The treatment cost everything we had and everything we didn't. After she died, I had a 6-year-old, a mountain of debt, and a job that needed me in Damascus. So I chose the job that let me be home by the time Sophie wakes up." Caroline didn't speak. She had heard men talk about sacrifice before at charity galas, in boardrooms, in magazine profiles designed to make executives look human, but she had never heard a man describe giving up everything he was built for and make it sound like the simplest decision he had ever made. Nathan told her the rest, and Caroline listened the way she had never listened to anyone, without planning her next sentence, without calculating how the information could be used. He had worked as an interpreter for the United States State Department for 12 years. 5 languages: English, French, Italian, Arabic, Spanish. He had translated for the American ambassador in Rome, sat in secure briefing rooms in Beirut, accompanied diplomatic delegations in Cairo and Paris. He had once spent 14 hours translating ceasefire negotiations in a room with no windows and no air conditioning. And, when the agreement was signed, the only person who thanked him was a janitor who had been waiting outside the door. The kind of career that ends with a title, a pension, and stories you're not allowed to tell at dinner parties. He had given it all up because a little girl needed her father at the breakfast table more than the government needed his tongue in a conference room. Caroline knew every city he named. She had been to all of them but from penthouse suites and first-class lounges, while Nathan had known them from the inside of windowless rooms where a single mistranslated phrase could shift a diplomatic relationship. For the first time, Caroline told Nathan something true about herself. Not the CEO version, not the Ashford heiress version. The version that lived underneath everything she had spent her life constructing. Her father had started her on French at 4, Italian at 7. Private tutors who filed weekly reports. He corrected her pronunciation at dinner parties, in front of business partners, in front of staff, not to help, but to harden. Every mistake was a mark against her. Every hesitation proved she wasn't good enough. She learned languages not out of curiosity or love, but out of the pure, cold need to avoid her father's disappointment. And somewhere along the way, fear became fluency. Fluency became a weapon, and the weapon became the only version of herself she knew how to be. Languages were never bridges for me, she said, turning the wine glass slowly in her fingers. They were walls I built so no one could get close enough to see I had nothing behind them. Nathan studied her face. Then why are you telling me this? Caroline stared at the glass. Because you walked right through every wall I put up, and you didn't even try. From behind the bar, Marco Bellini watched his best waiter sitting across from a guest at a candlelit table in an otherwise empty restaurant. He said nothing. He simply smiled, reached over, and dimmed the lights in the surrounding section. Then he poured himself a glass of grappa, raised it quietly in the direction of the two people who had completely forgotten he existed, and drank alone. Richard Ashford had not built a company worth $400 million by failing to notice things. He had people who watched on his behalf, not spies, exactly, but assistants whose loyalty was compensated well enough to include observation. When his executive assistant mentioned that Caroline had been visiting the same Greenwich restaurant several times a week and staying well past closing to speak with a waiter, Richard didn't react visibly. He simply picked up his phone after the assistant left and made a call. He didn't raise his voice. Richard Ashford never raised his voice. He called the owner of the restaurant group a man he had known for 15 years. A man whose entire wine program depended on Ashford Global Imports, and explained, in the measured tone of someone discussing a contract revision, that if a waiter named Nathan Cross continued serving tables at Tavola d'Oro, the supply agreement would need to be reconsidered. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. He simply reminded the man who signed the invoices. The next morning, Marco Bellini was called into the owner's office and given instructions that turned his stomach. Nathan Cross was to be removed from floor service, immediately transferred to the kitchen for dishwashing duty, or let go entirely. No table interaction. No tips, Marco argued until his voice was hoarse. The owner wouldn't budge. That afternoon, Marco found Nathan in the break room and delivered the news. Nathan listened without interrupting, his hands folded on the table. When Marco finished, his face tight with frustration and guilt, Nathan asked only one question. When? End of the week. I'm sorry, Nate. I tried. Nathan nodded. He untied his apron, folded it with care, and placed it on the table the same meticulous way he folded tablecloths at the end of every shift. The same steadiness he carried into everything, even the moment his livelihood was being stripped away. That night, Nathan sat on the floor beside Sophie's bed while she slept, her hand curled around the corner of her blanket, her French notebook resting on the nightstand, where she always kept it within reach. He opened his laptop and searched for waiter positions within a 30-minute radius of their apartment. The listings blurred together: chain restaurants offering minimum wage, catering companies with irregular hours, a country club 40 minutes away that required a car he didn't own. Without floor service at Tavola d'Oro, he would lose his tips, the majority of his income. He ran the numbers the way he used to run translation calculations in his head, quickly and without emotion. He had enough saved for 2 months of rent. After that, they would need to move. Sophie would lose her school, lose Mrs. Kowalski, lose the park bench where she sat on Saturday mornings reading the words her mother had written in a language that sounded like music. He picked up his phone and called Caroline. He didn't mention her father. He didn't accuse. He didn't blame. His voice was calm and tired, the voice of a man who had long ago learned that complaining about unfairness never once reversed it. "I think it's best if we don't see each other for a while. Your world and mine, they don't mix well. And I have a daughter who needs me to keep my job more than she needs me to prove a point." Caroline stood in her penthouse, the phone pressed to her ear, listening to the sound of a man who had already accepted the loss before he picked up the phone. She understood immediately what had happened. Her father had moved silently, precisely, without leaving fingerprints the way he had moved her entire life. And for the first time in 32 years, Caroline Ashford felt a rage that had absolutely nothing to do with herself. She wasn't angry because someone had hurt her pride. She was angry because someone had wielded her family's name like a blade against a man whose only crime was his decency. The next morning, Caroline walked into her father's corner office at Ashford Global Imports without knocking. Richard's assistant rose from her desk to intercept. Caroline looked at her one look, brief and final, and the woman sat back down. Richard was behind his mahogany desk gray suit, silver cufflinks, reading glasses perched on his nose. He glanced up as though he had been expecting this visit since the moment he made the call. Caroline spoke in English, not French, the language her father had always insisted she use in professional settings because it commands respect. The deliberate shift to English was itself an act of defiance. The first time she had ever chosen the common language over the one he had designed her to speak. "You called the restaurant," she said. Richard removed his glasses and set them on the desk. "I protected you. You protected your image. There's a difference. There always has been." He leaned back in his chair and regarded her with the same expression he used in negotiations: calm, analytical, faintly condescending. "He's a waiter, Caroline. He'll want your money, your name, your connections. They always do." "He didn't even want my apology," Caroline said. "I had to give it twice." The sentence stopped Richard mid-thought. It didn't fit the narrative he had operated under for 6 decades. The one where anyone below their station was always angling, always reaching, always looking for a way in. A man who had to be chased just to accept an apology was a variable his worldview couldn't process. Caroline did not sit down. She stood in front of his desk and spoke without wavering. "You will call that restaurant owner back. Nathan gets his job. Full hours. Full tables. Or, I walk not from dinner, not from a meeting from the company." Richard's jaw tightened. "You'd throw away everything for a waiter?" "He's a father who gave up a career at the State Department to be home for his daughter. You built an empire and couldn't name my favorite color." Richard said nothing. The silence in the office was absolute. "It's green, by the way." She turned and walked out without closing the door. That afternoon, Marco Bellini called Nathan. His voice carried a bewilderment that bordered on joy. "I don't know what happened, kid, but you're back. Full schedule. Starting tonight." Nathan understood who had acted on his behalf. He didn't call to thank her. He knew Caroline hadn't done it to be thanked. She had done it because, for the first time in her life, she had used her family's power for something that had nothing to do with protecting the Ashford name, and everything to do with protecting someone who couldn't protect himself. That evening, Nathan reported for his shift at Tavola d'Oro. There was a reservation at table 12. Name: Ashford. Party of one. Caroline was already seated when he approached, order pad in hand. They looked at each other across the white tablecloth, and both of them understood that everything between them had changed not in this moment, but in the slow accumulation of moments that had been building since the first night, since the park bench, since a little girl held up a notebook and said Lumiere. Caroline spoke in English, gently, without performance, without armor, without any language except the one she had been born speaking. "I'd like to order." In English, "And I'd like you to recommend something not what the chef made for his family, but what you'd make for yours." Nathan smiled. Not the measured, professional smile he wore on the floor, but the real one, warm and slightly lopsided, the one he saved for Saturday mornings and bedtime stories, and the moment Sophie said something that reminded him of Claire. "Sophie likes spaghetti with butter," he said. Nothing on the menu. Caroline held his gaze. "Then I'll have that." 3 months later, Nathan Cross still worked at Tavola d'Oro. Marco had promoted him to evening floor manager, better pay, a title that finally matched the way he had always carried himself, and a schedule that still allowed him to spend every morning with Sophie. He wore the same black vest and pink shirt, but now he stood at the host stand greeting guests instead of carrying an order pad between tables. The medical debt was going down faster. Sophie had started violin lessons. Caroline still ran Ashford Global Imports. But she had changed the way she moved through the world. She no longer ordered in foreign languages to test the people serving her. She no longer needed the armor her father had spent 3 decades welding onto her soul. She saw Vivian less often, Vivian, who remained unchanged, still laughing behind her manicured hand, still whispering in French about people she considered beneath her. But Caroline no longer needed that mirror. She had already seen what she had been, and she had chosen to become someone else. Richard Ashford did not transform. He was not built for transformation. But one afternoon, sitting alone in his office after the last meeting of the day, he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a photograph he hadn't looked at in years. Caroline, at 5 years old, laughing in the garden of their Greenwich estate, before the French tutors, before the Italian lessons, before he had turned language into discipline, and discipline into a wall between them. He placed the photograph on his desk, next to a Crystal Award for International Business Excellence. No one saw him do it, but it was there. On a quiet Sunday evening, Caroline arrived at Nathan's apartment for dinner. Not a restaurant. Not table 12. A third-floor walk-up with walls that needed painting and a radiator that clanked every 20 minutes. A small kitchen with mismatched chairs, plates that were not Italian porcelain, and a table that wobbled slightly if you leaned on it. Nathan stood at the stove, cooking spaghetti with butter, a dish that appeared on no menu in any restaurant in the world, but was the only thing his daughter ever requested. The apartment smelled like melted butter and garlic bread, and through the kitchen window, the lights of Greenwich twinkled in the distance like a world that existed on the other side of glass. Sophie ran to the door when she heard the knock, threw her arms around Caroline's waist, and pulled her to the table with the urgent authority of a child who has been waiting all day. She sat Caroline down, climbed into her own chair, and opened the notebook, her mother's notebook, with the fading blue ink and the tiny drawings. She turned to a page near the back. The handwriting here was different. The strokes were thinner, more elegant, the ink fresh and dark. Caroline had written a new word for Sophie. Sophie traced the letters with her finger, then read it aloud. Courage. Nathan looked at Caroline across the small table. Caroline looked back. Neither of them said a word in French or Italian or any of the languages they both knew how to speak. They didn't need to. Nathan Cross had once translated for ambassadors, generals, and presidents. He had stood in rooms where a single misplaced word could fracture a diplomatic relationship, where silence was strategy and language was power. But the most important thing he had ever heard was not in any language at all. It was the quiet moment when a woman stopped speaking in foreign tongues and started speaking as herself. and Caroline Ashford, who had mastered 7 languages before she ever learned how to say, "I'm sorry," had finally discovered the one language that appeared on no menu, in no textbook, in none of the curricula her father had ever forced upon her: the language of the heart. The kitchen light was warm and golden, the same amber glow as Tavola d'Oro, but without the white tablecloths, without the crystal stemware, without table 12, without the distance that money builds and pride maintains. 3 people sat around a small table, spaghetti with butter on mismatched plates, a notebook open to a word that meant brave, and for the first time in longer than any of them could remember, all 3 of them were home.